Hey, and welcome to the JMD Sunday Special. Today, we're going to be discussing 3 strategies you can use in discussing Jesus and the Messiah with your Jewish friends. But first, today's episode is sponsored by The Unapologetic Apologist. So head on over to subscribestar.com/TUA. When they start doing their regular show in January, you'll be able to get access to all the bonus content, bonus interviews, and exclusive videos and maybe previews of things. That they're working on. Then it's just $5 a month. You subscribe there and you get access to all of that. So I did not, extensively prepare for this episode, but I do have some notes because I am working on an episode I'm going to be doing on my channel, responding to some of Ben Shapiro's claims about Jesus and the Jewish Messiah. But so I just wanted to, because those are going to get into more specific examples. So for this episode, I'm going to try not to go down too many rabbit trails. I'm going to kind of try to just draw back out and provide you with just kind of 3 broad, more general kind of philosophical strategies for when you're having these conversations. So some of these things might, ask you to go and do a little bit more research into some of these ideas yourself. But hopefully what I'll be able to do is just kind of give you some strategy. So the first one, and this is kind of what Mike Winger talks about a lot, is separating the clear from the unclear. And what I mean specifically about that is understanding what the Old Testament is talking about when it's talking about what the Messiah is supposed to be like, and kind of why there are such differences between the Jewish understanding of the Messiah and obviously what Christians understand about the Messiah when reading the Old Testament. And I think one of these things is simply a confusion of what Jesus accomplished his first coming and what he's supposed to accomplish his second coming. And this distinction obviously matters because I think what happens is, a lot of some of the Old Testament passages, when Jews talk about, well, the Messiah is supposed to be a political figure, the Messiah is supposed to bring peace to Israel and restore the Davidic monarchy, and they go down a whole list of these things, and they'll say, see, Jesus didn't do any of these things in the first coming, therefore he can't possibly be the Messiah. But of course, Christians, we understand that some of those things, like the more political stuff, establishing world peace, will be accomplished in Jesus' second coming. So just having that idea and being able to bring that to bear when, if you're talking with a Jewish friend, you're going through some of these Old Testament passages like in Daniel or Isaiah, being able to understand that Jesus didn't necessarily accomplish everything his first coming, but of course we, as Christians, we do believe in a second coming, and so a lot of the disagreements could just be smoothed over by that. But just again, this is more just of a broad philosophical strategy, and again, even in places where it's unclear, again, you have to interpret that of the places where it is clear, and so it's not true that it's the case that Jews had this kind of monolithic understanding of what the Messiah was supposed to be all through the Old Testament, and then all of a sudden Jesus bursts onto the scene, and it's now radically different. Which even if it was, that's going to be when we get to the third piece. But that's simply not the case. And I just wanted to go through a few examples I have jotted down here, just so you can see that even as the New Testament writers are talking about this, that it's almost mirror images of the Old Testament. So, one of the notes I have here, hold on, I went backwards. So Mark 1:3 says, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight paths for him. Isaiah 40:3, clear the way for Yahweh in the wilderness, make smooth in the desert a highway for our God. So Mark is taking Yahweh and putting Jesus in that very same context. Mark 4:38 through 39, the disciples were on a boat caught in the storm, and they called to Jesus in their trouble, and he delivered them and made the storm to be still. Psalm 107, 25 to 29, God's people are on a boat caught in a storm, and they called out to Yahweh in their trouble, and he delivered them and made the storm to be still. In Mark 14:62, when Jesus is asked who he is, Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And in the Old Testament, we see a God-like figure coming in the clouds, which only God does. being given glory and dominion that only God is given, and seated at the right hand of God, and co-ruling the universe with God. And here Jesus is basically saying, remember all those verses with two God figures. One of those is me, and this is why they wanted to crucify him, because he was claiming to be God. Now, and actually, it's funny, actually, a lot of those kind of parallels I got from a debate Nabil Qureshi did with Shabir Ali. I highly recommend you go check that out. But anyway, these are just a few examples of Jesus being a clear mirror image of some of the Old Testament prophecy. And so, maybe things that aren't as clear should be interpreted in light of the clear things. But again, that's just the first strategy. Is just keep in mind that there is a distinction there between what Jesus accomplishes his first coming and what he accomplishes his second coming. And that was, for example, coming on the clouds and things like that. So now this bleeds right into the second strategy, and I mentioned this earlier, which is what we shouldn't do. What it's a mistake to do is to obviously look at what Jews today understand the Messiah is going to be like when he comes. But even also just looking at what the rabbis at the time of Jesus, or even right after, immediately following Jesus, the rabbis at the time of the early Christians, what they believed, and then taking that and saying, this is in specific contrast to Jesus or what the Christians are claiming. Therefore, there's a distinction that needs to be made. Excuse me. And well, anyway, it's a mistake to do that and not look at the history of what the Jews expected the Messiah to be like, how that developed over time, because that did change. Maybe not a great parallel, but a useful parallel is, for example, it's obviously always claimed that there are pre-Christ myths of dying and rising gods. And of course, Mithras is a good example because obviously there were Mithraic worshippers prior to Jesus. But what happens is, obviously there's hardly any similarities, almost none that are similar to Jesus. But then what you have is you have Roman Mithraic believers after Jesus copying communion from the early Christians, and then communion gets associated with Mithras, and people say, well, see, look, Mithraic believers were practicing communion before Jesus, and so that's more evidence that Jesus was copied. Not true. And the specific example I'm talking about as far as the distinction between the Jewish expectations of the Messiah and Jesus is, it's often seen, obviously, today that Jews we both believe in a monotheistic God, but the Jews believe he's one in person, and of course Christians believe in the Trinity, that God is three in person. And so Jesus being a godlike figure who's separate from the Yahweh seated in heaven, obviously makes sense to Christians, but maybe not so much to Jews. And so people say, or at least it seems that, okay, well, you have the Old Testament and there's one God, but then there's a Messiah who's kind of a separate person. He's not in the Godhead. And then, here you have the New Testament come, and then Christians making all these wild claims about the Trinity. And even the things Jesus is claiming, and this is in contrast to what the Jews believed. That's actually not true. Historically, a lot of Jews, especially during the time of the Old Testament, were binitarian in their theology, meaning that they believed that there were at least two persons in the Godhead. And I have something written down here, but that's really important to understand. Even if you look at early Jewish commentaries on some of the Old Testament verses talking about the Messiah, in places where there were two Yahwehs mentioned, a lot of the Jewish commentaries took that second Yahweh out and put a Logos in its place. And of course, we hear that a lot of the time in the Old Testament, Jesus being associated with the Logos. Well, the early Jews were doing that with some of these Old Testament verses. And I have this written down here. I'm going to butcher this last name, but it's Daniel Boyarin, who's a Jewish scholar. And he said, Jews in general did entertain a Logos, and so were implicitly binitarian in their theology. It is only the rabbis in response to Christianity who begin to make such opinions heretical. But they were binitarian at the time of Jesus precisely because of the Old Testament verses. So even at the time of Jesus, Jews were binitarian in their theology. And again, it's only in response, the rabbis create, in response to the early Christians, they begin to make those teachings heretical. And then so that's why you see a more contrast later. But so the first strategy is kind of distinguishing Jesus' first coming and second coming and interpreting the unclear in light of the clear. And our second strategy here is understanding the development of the Jewish expectations of the Messiah over time, because it wasn't just this one monolithic thing that stayed steady, and then all of a sudden Jesus comes here and contradicts it all. A lot of the Jewish beliefs were more in line with a godlike figure, the Messiah being a God-man who accomplishes things and even is a second person in the Godhead. And again, it's just in response to early Christianity that some of these things start changing. But so now our third strategy is going to be, well, let's say Jesus did just completely burst on the scene and just contradict everything Judaism had taught up to that point. Obviously, there's big problems with that, and I don't agree with that at all, right? I think Jesus completes the Old Testament. I don't think he contradicts it. I think, obviously, the Old Testament is very essential to Christian theology. This is why Christians and Jews have so much in common. But our third strategy is really just going to revolve around the evidence for the resurrection and not letting Jews get away with not having to provide an alternative explanation or explain away the evidence for the resurrection in the same way we require of the atheists when we have these debates. I'm reminded of when William Lane Craig appeared on Ben Shapiro's Sunday special, and Ben Shapiro is saying, well, why should we, if we had this Jewish understanding, this Jewish interpretation of the Old Testament, what the Messiah was supposed to be like, and Jesus comes and contradicts that, why would we accept Jesus's reinterpretation over the interpretation of the so-called experts at the time? And William Lane Craig essentially said, well, I think we should accept Jesus's reinterpretation because he proved he was God by dying and rising from the dead. And then he, listed all the evidence for that. And I think this is something we get stuck with Jews quite often. We get stuck debating these Old Testament verses and, well, what does it say in the actual Hebrew, and how do we understand the Messiah in this context, and then the expectations of the Messiah in that context. And we almost never get hammered down on the evidence, the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, at least not to the same extent that we do with atheists. And we say to atheists, hey, listen, you either got to come with a naturalistic explanation or an alternative explanation, or, dispute some of the historical facts, say they aren't really facts, provide, alternatives. And we don't, and maybe there's just something I'm missing. Maybe I'm just missing out on some of these debates, but it does seem, at least not to the extent we do with atheists, that we kind of demand that burden of proof from Jewish people. Because, of course, if it's not enough for Jews to just say, hey, listen, when I read the actual Hebrew of the Old Testament, I don't have expectations of the Messiah that would look anything like Jesus, and I just don't think Jesus fulfills these roles. I just don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. But then the Jew would still have to, well, by consequence, he would believe Jesus obviously didn't rise from the dead, and then maybe other historical things, but then the implication is, well, he would have to have an alternative explanation for that. So our third strategy is just press your Jewish friends when you're having these conversations. Well, what is your alternative explanation? How do you explain these historical facts surrounding Jesus, his crucifixion, the post-mortem appearances, the empty tomb? How do you deal with these things, and what do you think really happened to Jesus? What do you think happened with the body? What do you think explains the appearances? And so I've been trying to avoid being too specific because I could go down a lot of rabbit trails here, but these, I hope just this has kind of helped you, just drawing back, having these kind of broader philosophical strategies. So again, the first one, interpreting the unclear in light of the clear, making distinctions between Jesus' first coming and the second coming in light of the Old Testament passages that talk about the Messiah. Our second is understanding the development of the Jewish beliefs and expectations of the Messiah over time, and how they changed in response to early Christianity. And then our third strategy is just press your Jewish friends to how do they deal with the historical evidence for Jesus? What's their explanation for what occurred, for why we have the evidence, for why it is the way it is? And yeah, I think that's all for me. And I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Sunday Special. Again, this was kind of last minute. I'm kind of drawing from some really scribbled notes that I have here that I made a while ago that I gotta get together better. And again, starting in January, I'm going to be having a regular show once a week. And there's gonna be I'm gonna be trying to do one interview with an apologist for each of the shows, and then there's going to be bonus content from those interviews that are specifically going to be behind the paywall at subscribestar.com/TUA. Again, you subscribe just $5 a month, and you'll get you'll get access to all the bonus content there. Thank you guys so much for joining me for tonight's JMD Sunday special, and hopefully I'll see you again next week, or even earlier on my channel. Go subscribe to my channel, The Unapologetic Apologists. Thanks, guys.